Moving on to Federalist Era Part 7, we're establishing the difference between strict construction of the Constitution and loose construction. The first time that came up was in the debate over whether to establish the Bank of the United States in 1791. As I was saying, Madison charged that the legislation chartering the bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution does not specifically permit Congress to grant corporate charters, which it doesn't. That's strict construction, the idea that Congress can only do those things that the Constitution specifically and in so many words authorizes or permits. All right? Hamilton's reply, or his defense of it, introduced loose construction or liberal construction, and that's basically the doctrine of implied powers, based on Article 1, Section 8, Clause like 18 or 1918, I think, which says that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to the carrying into execution of the foregoing powers. So if Congress needs to do something that is not on the list in order to do something that is on the list, makes it constitutional. The Supreme Court did not recognize the doctrine of implied powers until 1819, but it's well established now, whatever was intended. The debate continues. It's moved, though, from the powers of the legislative branch to the powers of the judicial branch. The strict construction viewpoint today, that baton is carried by what we call advocates of judicial restraint, that judges are bound to recognize that other branches of government do have power, and that they are to apply the law and the Constitution strictly according to the intention of the legislators who wrote the law or the Constitution writers who wrote the Constitution, and not get too creative with it. The other viewpoint, the loose constructionists, that is represented by judicial activism. That is the idea that since judges have all this power, they have a kind of duty to use it, interpreting the Constitution freely, updating it, if you will, to just solve problems and, in effect, sort of remaking the Constitution. With that, if that doctrine applies, then the Constitution is simply modeling clay. It's putty in the hands of a handful of people in long black robes. I personally don't agree with it at all. Okay? As if the Constitution writers were setting up an amendment procedure which is complex, it's difficult, it's demanding, it shouldn't be done very often because it's a hugely portentous thing. Or we could just let 5 people do it. Yeah, right. Okay, so judicial activists inevitably fall victim to the idea that they're there to, that they don't think that's what they're doing, but it is. They're advancing a political agenda. People on that side would say that giving originalists who take the judicial self-restraint people a majority, that is packing the court when there's got to be a standard. So I'm going to say originalism is the gold standard. You go by the Constitution. So there have been cases within the last few years and all up and down the timeline for the last, since the 1930s actually, where justices on the Supreme Court were debating policy issues. Would this be a good policy or not? That sort of thing. That's not their job. If Congress has done something they don't like, the only question is whether Congress legitimately had that power. They can decide whether they had it or not, and it better be firmly rooted in the Constitution. The idea is out there that the Constitution itself is back up the road. Forget about it. It's just a bunch of 18th century slaveholders that wrote it. That's not really true. And that the Constitution is a deep accumulation of Supreme Court rulings that have been piling up for 2 centuries. We got to get away from that. Sooner the better. That's just from me to you. Because the Constitution is there to provide a limited government. The government exists for the purpose of guaranteeing our liberty, our freedom, And the more power the government has, the more freedom we have left, the less freedom we have left. What is power? Define power any way other than being in a position to compel people to do things they would not freely choose to do, or to prevent them from doing things they would freely choose to do, and freedom gets stomped like an insect once that gets loose. Okay, that's just for me to you call it editorial opinion. Not everyone shares that. It's kind of what this is election day, kind of what election day is about this time. All right, one little story I always tell, though I don't have time. Once long ago in another life, I happened to be a high school government teacher, government and economics, down at Granbury. I did that for a decade or so. It's been a while. My last group of seniors are now like 43 years old. But I used to give fill-in-the-blank chapter quizzes. There was a chapter quiz one time where the correct answer was loose construction. And in the blank, a student had written, they got loose construction and lame duck mixed up. What appeared in the blank was loose duck. Heck of a nice guy that I am, I gave him half credit. Okay, same semester, another fill-in-the-blank question on a chapter quiz. The correct answer was gerrymander, sometimes mispronounced gerrymander. It's when legislators draw oddly shaped legislative and congressional districts, which they have the power to do, in order to give the party that controls the legislature an advantage in the elections, called gerrymandering. Well, what the student had written in the blank was merrygander, leaving me to wonder what would happen, what would ensue if the merrygander should encounter the loose duck. I'm guessing that's PG at the least. Cover your eyes, Penelope. Okay, we'll leave that by. The Bank of the United States was set up. It was chartered in 1791. I believe this is the one where the principals, Hamilton and Madison, and maybe one or two others, they just got together over supper one night and worked out a deal. It had been decided that there would be a national capital city, a new city which would be the nation's capital, but since putting it in any of the 13 states would give whatever state it was located in an unfair advantage, they would create a special district that was not part of any state and put the capital there. Now, both the North and the South wanted it, so the Southerners, Madison, agreed to drop their objection to the national bank in exchange for the new national capital being located in the South. Turned out to be between Virginia and Maryland on the Potomac River. Those two states had agreed to donate to the national government a total of 100 square miles, 10 square mile block. Actually, it's 100 square miles. It was 10 miles on a side, oblong, with the river running through it. Virginia reneged, so it's all what used to be Maryland. They call it the District of Columbia. And just, they talk about draining the swamp today. The reason nobody wanted the land was it was a swamp. It continued to be for quite a while. But the new national capital was built starting in the 1790s, and they named it, of course, after George Washington, City of Washington, District of Columbia. Okay, the first president to live in the building now known as the White House was John Adams in about 1800. Okay, so in all these debates, the people on different sides, the ones who looked at it the way Jefferson did, and the ones who looked at things the way Hamilton did, were becoming more and more suspicious of each other. So this is basically during Washington's first and second terms as president. So out of this is going to emerge what amounts to a two-party political system. Our first two political parties called themselves the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. That's interesting. The Federalists came first. They organized from the top down. These were politicians who favored the Hamiltonian approach. Okay, that's going to be favoring a strong central government, stable money supply. Europe was then moving into a lengthy period of warfare growing out of the French Revolution. Profound philosophical differences between Britain, which represents conservatism, and France, which represents completely out of control political radicalism. So the Federalists were pro-British on that. They took the name Federalists, hoping that voters would associate them with the pro-Constitution faction when the Constitution was under debate. I can't look you in the eye and tell you that there was a direct connection there, because too many of the Federalists later became Democratic Republicans. So I don't think the Federalists as a political party, which they would have denied that they were, is a direct descendant of that. They organized from the top down. As you have a clique in Congress, both houses, of Hamiltonians. And they are first to perceive that their opponents who kind of get in their way, they have to run for re-election. So, letter writing campaign, like the plant in the Little Shop of Horrors, this congressional clique sends out chutes and runners. You get in touch with your college friends, army buddies, relatives who think the right way. And let's say you have been opposing the Hamiltonians. Next thing you know, the next election, a well-financed opponent just sort of jumps up out of the ground, and you're fighting for your political survival. So soon enough, as I say, they start calling themselves Federalists. Washington, our only technically nonpartisan president, permits himself to be used as their symbol because he did lean in their direction in terms of philosophy. The actual leaders were two men who were neither well acquainted nor mutually sympathetic. In other words, they didn't get along. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, the vice president. Now, Adams viewed Hamilton as an upstart, a social upstart. Adams was still very much in kind of the old attitude our European ancestors brought with them of there being social ranks, social classes, and the idea of this nobody, this poor boy made good, being powerful in national politics, disgusted him. So that's going to be part of the reason the party didn't really last very long. But they attempt to influence public opinion through a newspaper. And named John Fenno sets up a newspaper in the new capital city, where originally it was New York, moved promptly to Philadelphia, and then down to D.C. at the end of the decade. The Gazette of the United States. And they could depend on local newspapers, of which there were hundreds across the states, simply copy out and plagiarize its stories. Now, it was not neutral. It presented the doings of the president and Congress in a strongly pro-federalist with the slant or spin. So there you go. Now, the fatal flaw of the Federalists, who consider themselves the best people. They describe themselves as the best people. They were the men of property who alone considered themselves to be worthy to wield the power of government. They never reached out for mass identification, which is mother's milk to political parties ever since. Whichever party you are, you want everybody, as many people as possible. So you're a Democrat, you want as many people as possible get up and look in the mirror in the morning and see a Democrat looking back at them. Or a Republican, as the case might be. Those are today's parties. So, because that is the number one thing that determines voter behavior. Federalists didn't do that. They just didn't. They didn't know to do that. They have a strong Republican small R view. They believe that elected officials are there to do right by their own lives, not what the mob wants them to do. So it didn't matter to Federalists whether they were popular or not. Why not? Because they didn't believe the regular people actually even know enough to have what could be called an opinion. They're there to do right. So the idea, one thing missing from the idea of a republic is that the government exists to carry out the public will. I'm out of time.